Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining me here today for this Reliability 101 Initial Engagement Submissions presentation. My name is Rebecca Barber, and I'm a Compliance Team Lead here at Texas RE. Now, first, I want to mention our antitrust admonition. Please review as you're able, and if you have any questions, please direct those to Texas RE's General Counsel. And before I get into the meat of the presentation, I just want to give a quick agenda of what we're going to be covering here today. So first, I'm going to cover the value of the initial submission, why we're talking about it here today. Then I'm going to go into an engagement timeline, just a general overview of what this audit looks like. And then our initial submission expectations, what we're expecting as part of the evidence that you're going to be submitting. So why are we talking about this today? So there's really two main reasons why the initial engagement submission is so important. First of all is we have fewer questions. In an ideal world, you'll submit a complete initial engagement submission. All the evidence and narratives that you supply will reach reasonable assurance and get you to compliance, and we won't have to submit any additional RFIs as part of that audit. Now, I did say that's in an ideal world. It doesn't usually occur because we will have additional questions for internal controls or maybe risk-based questions, but even those can be answered as part of the initial submission. And secondly, this is a reference point. This is kind of a jumping off point for the auditors. If we have any additional questions, it will be based off of what you've submitted here. Maybe we'll have those internal controls questions or risk-based questions kind of formulating in the back of our minds from what you've already submitted. Now let's get into the timeline. So really what we're focusing on for this presentation is this first portion here, but I'll just go over briefly the entirety of what this audit's going to look like. So first, we'll have the handover call with the primary compliance contact, with our risk department, and the engagement team lead for that audit. What's going to be discussed during there is where you're going to understand what the scope for this audit is. We're going to go over a general timeline or schedule of what that audit is going to look like. And this really establishes these communication pathways with that ETL. Next, the audit notification package is going to be sent to you at 120 days before the official start date, which you see further down that line. And then about 30 days or a month after that, you are going to submit that initial evidence into the NERC Secure Evidence Locker, or SEL. That is going to be at 90 days before that official start date. And that 90 days, essentially 3 months, is going to make up the bulk of the audit. This is where the audit team is going to ask any additional requests for information or RFIs. Maybe we'll need to conduct some subject matter expert calls. And this is where we're going to be documenting and reviewing evidence. Past that, we'll have our tabletop week, that first day of which is the official start date, or 0 day. This is where the audit team is just reaching consensus on any findings or maybe no findings for that audit. And then if it's needed, we'll have an on-site audit after that. And then after that, a summary or exit brief, depending on if you had any findings or not. So let's get into what's included as part of that audit notification package. So this is when the audit is going to become visible in a line. You're going to see the standards that are in scope. You're going to see the monitoring period, and you're going to see the audit notification letter and RFIs included within a line as well. This is really just the interface that we use to communicate with you. So what's included as part of that audit notification letter? This is your official notice that you're being audited for the standards and requirements that are in scope. It'll also include some instructions on what needs to be included and filled out for that initial submission. So it's good to pay attention to that and make sure you're checking off what needs to be done as part of that. And then additionally, it'll include the biography of the team members that are part of this audit. It'll include the name of the team member and then previous experience. This will also be where any NERC or FERC observers are going to be listed if that is going to occur for that audit. And additionally, we'll have the initial request for information. This is going to be the bulk of the request for information or RFIs that are going to be sent as part of this engagement. Any other RFIs are generally going to be clarifying questions. Maybe we'll ask for additional evidence as needed, but generally we try and keep those few and far between. So now let's get into that initial engagement submission, that 90 days when you have to input all of this into Align and the SEL. So what are we expecting back? First, we need to see the completed compliance narratives and supporting documents. We'll need to see the responses to RFIs, and then we'll be looking at that evidence that is going to be submitted to the NERC Secure Evidence Locker or the SEL. Now, if you have a BES artifact exemption that was submitted and approved, this might look like you have your own SEL, in which we'll need access to, or there's some other approved methods that you can submit that evidence, whether it's on maybe a different laptop that you provide to us, or it's going to be in person. So I talked about those components of that initial submission. Let's really start breaking it down on what we're expecting for each of those components. So first we have the compliance narrative and supporting evidence. Now, this is in Align. There's two different interfaces depending on if this is a compliance audit or a self-certification, but really both of these are pretty much the same. So for a compliance audit, you'll see over here on the left, you'll have your compliance narrative, and it even has a description of what you need to include as part of that. Really, you're just providing a brief explanation on how you're reaching compliance for this specific requirement. This is also a great time to highlight any internal controls that you've implemented and maybe any other tools that aren't referenced within your process documentation. Past that, you'll also see this table. This is where you can list out any evidence that you provided, the relevant pages, and maybe a description of the applicability for that document. On the self-certification side, there's really two major differences. One, you have a drop-down where you'll indicate whether you're self-certify that you are compliant or not compliant with that part. And the other difference is it just doesn't have that table requesting the specific evidence, the page that it's on, and all of that. What it does have is that it asks you for comments that may be related to this requirement. Really, that is the same as the compliance narrative. If you certify that you're compliant, we want to understand how you've met compliance. And if for some reason you've certified that you were not compliant, we want to understand how that happened as well. Now, for anybody who's been around for a while, you may notice that this is actually pretty reflective of the NERC RSAWs. So what used to happen is that the entity would submit these to us with this portion here filled out. What the auditors would then do is go through and use that same document to document our narrative and review that evidence. The only difference is we just took this and put it into Align. These days, we don't necessarily need this section filled out. However, the NERC RSAW is still very relevant, mostly for the second part here, the compliance assessment approach. Now, not all RSAWs have really good information as part of this in here, but it's always good to review just in case. So I have CIP 5 requirement 1, part 1.1 as an example here. And that really important part is the notes to auditor. So those first sections is really just a regurgitation of that standard language, and you can submit your process documentation and implementation documentation to meet that language of the standard. But that notes to auditor section is some additional things that we look for as auditors to ensure that you have reached compliance for this part. What you can do is look at this and make sure that the process documentation and the implementation documentation that you have provided really meets these asks as part of this. So this is just a good reference point for y'all to look at when you are submitting this evidence. So now let's get into those requests for information or RFIs. So it's going to be the same for both compliance audits and self-certifications, and that's going to be this interface here in Align. Really, the important parts are that request your comments. This is where we're going to have our ask, where we're requesting either a narrative or additional evidence. You're going to have the respondent comments. This is where you're just going to enter your response. And then for the evidence, you'll see down here at the bottom in bold, this is going to be your SEL tag. Now, what are you going to do with that? So when you go to submit that evidence into the SEL, and you can see it in this picture here on the left, you will put that tag in, you'll validate it, make sure it goes through. If for some reason it doesn't, go ahead and contact the ETL, we'll try and work it out with you. And then you'll upload the relevant files that relate to that tag. Now, NERC has a good guidance document on how to use the SEL and everything that's included, but I wanted to go ahead and cover some of the limitations for the files that can be submitted here. So first of all, individual file uploads are going to be limited to 100 megabytes in size. If you have to submit something that's larger than that, go ahead and contact the ETL. We'll see if there's something else or some other way that you can submit that evidence. We ask that you do not use the percentage character in those file names. That does break the file naming convention. And of course, we ask for no compression or executable files. Those are going to be .zip files, .7z, .exe. All of those are going to be rejected by the SEL. Some other things to remember, anything with embedded macros is treated like an executable file. That will also be rejected. And finally, while it is allowed, we ask that you do not submit PDF portfolios. Those can be kind of confusing to document, and it's hard to find within the SEL. While you can submit them, typically what will happen is we'll ask you to resubmit all that evidence as separate documents. So really, this is just a time saver. So let's get into that evidence that you're going to be submitting, what we're looking for as part of that. So it really comes down to three components. We're going to be requesting your process documentation, your population documentation, what your population is, and then finally the implementation. How did you reach compliance? So let's get into what is going to be needed as part of your process documentation. So you're going to provide and reference those documented processes. Maybe you have multiple processes, or maybe you have a overarching policy and then desk procedures on how these things are going to happen. Either way, we're going to need to see the entirety of your process documentation that meets compliance for that standard or requirement. We want you just to explain how you're doing this. If it's not a very detailed process, we're going to have additional questions on exactly what you did for your process. And then this is a great opportunity to identify any systems or tools that you use. This is also a great time to include any internal controls used for that standard and requirements. Next is the population portion. This is where we're going to identify any applicable facilities, events, personnel, and assets, and then we're going to sample off of that further. For some standards, we may even ask you how to explain how that population was identified, though it's not really needed for most standards and requirements out there. So I do want to give an example of what that looks like when we're requesting population or even sample set evidence. So I'm using SIP here as an example, particularly SIP5. So what usually happens is that the entity will submit this completed SIP evidence request tool, or ERT, to RISC prior to the handover, and it will include a filled out population tab like you see on this first picture here. This is the Cyber Assets tab. What will happen from there is that the audit team will receive it. We will sample based on that full population. It'll be a subset, so maybe just 20 assets instead of the entire 500. And what we're going to do is submit that back to you with the sample sets along with that audit notification package. What that's going to look like is you'll see in that far column for the second page, we'll have the sample set index numbers and dates. That's going to be for what particular assets we're asking for. And then we have this evidence request. So essentially, for this request, provide this evidence in this request for each of the sampled assets over to the side. That's typically what it's going to look like. For the OMP standards, usually we'll request that population evidence as part of the ANL in separate RFIs. And then we will send back our sampling questions on a later date. So now let's get into the implementation. This is going to make up the bulk of the evidence that is submitted, and generally this is considered the most important portion of the evidence. So what's going to happen during that 30 days is that you're going to either create that evidence or retrieve that evidence. What that's going to look like is maybe you're generating reports, capturing screenshots of certain systems, or you're going back into your records to retrieve evidence throughout the monitoring period. We ask that you annotate and highlight as necessary just to show us exactly where in the submitted evidence it shows that you're meeting the standard and requirements. And then, like I said previously, those examples should be scoped down to just the sampled assets depending on your population size. So I talked about reasonable assurance quite a few times during this presentation. So I really wanted to get into what reasonable assurance is. And really it's comprised of two different parts, whether it's sufficient or if it's appropriate. And both of these definitions come from the government auditing standards, or some may call it the Yellow Book. So what sufficiency is, it's a measure of the quantity of evidence used to support the findings and conclusions related to the audit objectives. And then appropriateness is going to be the measure of the quality of evidence that encompasses the relevance, the validity, and the reliability of evidence used for addressing the audit objectives and supporting findings and conclusions. So what does this look like as part of the actual evidence that you're going to submit? So appropriateness, what we're looking for is that that evidence really shows how you're meeting compliance for that standard requirement. So if we're asking for evidence on patching, we're not really looking for evidence of your firewall rules. That wouldn't be relevant for the standard requirement that's in scope. But what that typically looks like is your process documentation, the implementation from that. But all those pieces by themselves, if you just submitted one or two, isn't really going to get you to reasonable assurance that you were compliant with that standard and requirement. So that's where the sufficiency piece comes in. That's the quantity of evidence. What we're going to do is stack all of that evidence together, and that's where it gets us to reasonable assurance. Now, as we wind down this presentation, I do want to touch on a couple of things to avoid when you're doing this initial evidence submission. So first we have what I call data dumping, and this is going to be when large amounts of data or evidence is going to be submitted, and not all of it may be relevant to the standard requirements and scope, or even necessary to reach reasonable assurance. For example, you may get a request for implementation evidence without any sample set specified. This is particularly common with OMP standards. This is usually because we typically see entities will only have a small population or only a couple of instances of what is being asked for. However, every entity is different. You might have a large population size. In this case, we ask that you work with the ETL, so you're not submitting dozens, if not even hundreds of documents that would really slow down and take up a lot of you and your team's time. Another example could be in the case of a large document where maybe not all of that evidence is relevant to the standard and requirement that we're asking for. If it is very large, we may send that back and ask you to highlight and annotate that evidence in an RFI just to show what you're doing to meet compliance. Another common pinch point is going to be missing evidence. And this is where evidence files referenced within the compliance narrative or in responses to RFIs were not uploaded to the SEL. So it may be best to keep a checklist of the evidence that you're going to submit and just check it off as you're submitting it. Like I said earlier, this is going to be the most amount of requests that we do for evidence during this time frame, and it can get to be quite a bit to keep track of. On a similar note, we also have uncorrelated evidence. And this is going to be a similar problem to missing evidence, but really just the reverse. This is where we see evidence in the SEL, but we don't see that reference within the compliance narrative or any RFIs, and we might not really know what to do with it. In such a case, we would send another RFI asking for clarification. What you may notice for all three of these is that we're asking additional RFIs and asking additional requests for information. And really, we want to keep these RFIs relevant to reach that reasonable assurance. We want to make sure we're using the best use of your time. Now, before we end here, I just want to recap the key points for this. Really, I want to highlight that a complete initial evidence submission really is a good opportunity to show off the maturity of your compliance and internal control programs. What we're expecting as part of that is we just need you to tell the story. That's going to be your process documentation. We need to understand what's applicable. So that's the population portion of that. and then how did you do it, your implementation piece. And all that together should get to reasonable assurance, should get you over that compliance hurdle, and well on our way to the end of the audit. So as I'm wrapping this up, I do want to say this is our contact information. If you do have any questions about this initial evidence submission, you can go ahead and email us here at compliance@texasre.org, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I'd like to thank you all for joining me here today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.